among you and some that I don't know. But Tuesday night during 2 weeks before Christmas is a busy time for everyone, so I appreciate your coming. I have to say to you that I felt
could you come to the circulation desk?
my naval career was a very fortunate one. I was a very lucky person, and I still look back on it as being something that I was very fortunate to have been able to do. This program originated at Holy Trinity, as Dawn told you, Lutheran Church, the men's breakfast. And Dawn thought that all of us who were in World War II were getting old enough that we were either going to forget what we saw or knew, or we were going to die and it wouldn't be recorded. I don't look forward to either of those events, but it could happen. My presentation will cover what happened to me personally, as just one of the many who were part of World War II. This story does not contain the exciting accounts of the war in the Pacific, some of which we have heard from Joe Nemec in the last 2 sessions that we had here. It doesn't have the air battles over Germany, which we'll have later in the spring, nor the infantry in France and Germany, but a rather routine service which certainly was duplicated many times with people filling non-spectacular duty stations. I plan to say where this started, what training I had, and why I was assigned to Brazil. Incidentally, I wasn't there all of my career, as that flyer says. Dawn keeps repeating. I was there 2 years out of 4. And what it was like and what happened when the problem in the South Atlantic began to get contained. On December 7th, 1941, I was in McKeesport, a steel town in southwest Pennsylvania, working in the National Works of U.S. Steel. I graduated from Penn's Wharton School in 1940 and was getting broad experience in a large steel mill. I was 23 years old. I immediately applied for a commission in the Naval Reserve. It happened for me, and my duty as an ensign was at the Philadelphia Navy Yard in the Naval Aircraft Factory. Naval Aircraft Factory is sort of an unusual factor in the Navy Yard. It has been there for many, or I should say was there for many years. I doubt very much whether there is any remnant of it at this point. This unusual operation was producing the Navy version of the PBY-5A, which was an amphibian, which was used for anti-submarine warfare and air-sea rescue. The principal production of these planes was by Consolidation Aircraft on the West Coast, which designed and built hundreds of them, and maybe even thousands of them. The NAF program was to establish a cost basis, which had been done over the years for different aircraft. I believe it probably was encouraged by Congress to the Navy Department in order to control the cost of any of the new aircraft that were online. They also did experimental work on many things, wind tunnels, radar installations, launching mechanisms for carriers, parachutes, pilots' clothing, matters of this nature. It was a great indoctrination for someone who was going to be involved in naval aviation. Next, I was sent to the Naval Supply Corps School at Harvard. When I graduated, my orders read to proceed immediately to Norfolk for further transportation to Fleet Air Wing 11 in San Juan, Puerto Rico. I wondered about my possible leave at that point, and I went to the Captain McIntosh, who was head of the Naval Supply School there, and he said, well, I can't do anything. It's here, and you're due in Norfolk the next day. And he said, talk to them down there. That was bad advice, as all of you probably know. I took a train for Boston, and while changing trains in Washington, called my wife-to-be, who was working there, to tell her that our plans to spend some time together would have to be put aside as the train to Norfolk was leaving in 10 minutes, so I never even got to see her. I flew out of Norfolk to San Juan via Guantanamo. It's not on that map, but out of Norfolk, out here to Guantanamo, right there, and then to San Juan, which is where I thought I was going to end up. But the personnel department told me that don't unpack. You're going to the advanced base unit in Natal. And I thought Natal, state of Natal, South Africa. But it turned out to be Natal, Brazil. Just as well. People have frequently asked me over the years, why Brazil? The anti-submarine warfare was the answer. The Battle of the Atlantic was still being lost to the U-boat. To put it in perspective, I cite these statistics for the 6 years 1939 to 1945. 4,786 merchant ships sunk, 158 British, 29 American warships sunk, 40,000 Allied seamen lost, 32,000 German submariners lost, 781 U-boats sunk. Germany had used the submarine in World War I very successfully and resorted to it as soon as World War II began. The passenger ship Athenia was sunk within 10 hours after war was declared, and a British carrier, Courageous, was sunk later in the month of September with a loss of 508 men aboard. The Athenia had about 200 Americans who were on their way as the last ship out of England before the war began. Not all the people, 1,500 of them, were drowned on the Athenia, but a number of them were. The strategy was to isolate the British Isles, which depended on supplies from its then extensive empire. After the fall of France, the ports available to the U-boats moved to the coast, which made resupply and repairs much quicker and less hazardous than returning to Germany from the Baltic Sea. As you can see up here, suddenly made all these ports right here available to the submarines, rather than having to come back up here and down into here into the German ports, and with the risks of being detected coming out here. Don has pushed this one up 7 December 41 to 31 July 42, and that was some of this is after the all of it is after the United States got into it, and you can see the number of sinkings in here and also in the Caribbean, and of course a lot of these were tankers coming from the oil fields here in Venezuela to Aruba, where the refineries were, and also to the ultimate market, East Coast here. The British countered with convoys, which assembled off of Nova Scotia and Newfoundland. With huge quantities of military supplies being produced in the United States, the desire to deliver caused us to push our convoy coverage further and further out into the Atlantic. This course, even in spite of the Neutrality Act at that time. We were skating on the narrow edge. Add Russia to this mix in June 1941, and the North Atlantic became very critical. Germany found the Wolf Pack, 8 to 20 U-boats in a group, a fearsome attack force to set upon a large convoy. For the U.S. entry into the war, the Germans expanded the area for submarine activity to the East Coast, the Gulf of Mexico, and the Caribbean. Whereas prior to that, I think it concentrated here and also trying to intercept the convoys coming out of Newfoundland, not daring to come in this area because we were still neutral at that time. Of course, after Russia got into the war, like the track up here to Murmansk in Russia, which was the northern port that they could get to. Other than that, they would have to go through the Baltic Sea, which was very difficult for any convoy at that time. Some of us can remember the sinkings off the Jersey Shore in the summer of 1942 as we resisted the blackouts of our cities. The enemy called it the happy hunting ground. You can imagine the picture of a group of vessels, probably mostly tankers, coming along the Jersey Shore with the submarine on the outside, and the reflection of the lights in back of it made a perfect target. And this also, you can remember the oil from the tankers that was dumped onto the beaches on the Jersey Shore and the Connecticut shore, Virginia shore. The U.S. was slow to learn the convoy system and had limited organized air squadrons for patrol work. The Air Force helped out, but the planes were not designed for anti-submarine work, and the pilots were not trained in this tedious job, and it is tedious. As personnel and planes became available, the operating bases were expanded onto the islands opened up by the British. And that's destroyer deal, 50 destroyers for rights on Bermuda and other English bases. As personnel and planes, Brazil also became a logical area for the development of bases. However, there had been substantial German and Italian communities located in Brazil. And it was no sure thing that Brazil was going to declare war. Well, during this period of about 9 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, they finally did declare war on August 21st, 1942. All of South America was covered by German, Italian, and French airlines, and that was all going on at the same time. However, Pan Am flew the Boeing flying boats out of the U.S. to Rio de Janeiro, developing seaplane bases along the way during the 1930s. That was all. And here, Trinidad, and Paramaribo, and then along the coast of Brazil, the land where it lays up by Rio, so that there were seaplane bases already developed there, which it doesn't take much to develop a seaplane base except good water. The Aviation Development Project was building airfields with the permission of the Brazilian government and the financing of the United States government. These bases were ready to handle patrol planes and B-17s and B-24s en route to North Africa and India. Don, you do have the sinkings there on, as you can see the concentration again as I repeat, but not down here yet. Could you throw the next one up, please? Here you go from August 1st, 21 May 1943. You can see what has come down into here. And of course, the route of the convoys was to Dakar, and the planes that were flying out of Natal, which is northern enough, but this was right here. This is Dakar. We call this the South Atlantic Narrows. It isn't so narrow, but when you really get down to it. The Air Corps would fly about 100 planes a day. First stop in Brazil would be Belém, then Natal, then Dakar. Some of the shorter range planes had to go through Ascension, which would be about here, do it in stages. Sometimes in Belém, you would have afternoon showers, thunder showers. You know about those. And at periods of time when it was intensive every afternoon. And when these flights would arrive in Belém, there were many, many times that they couldn't land. And at that time, not every plane that was going into the mill had proper navigation equipment, nor did they have navigators. Sometimes they had 3 to 1 navigator in one plane. And if you got over Belém and then you ended up back in here's the Amazon here, and the jungles here, well, you were in real tough trouble. At one point, there was a pilot, Tom Harmon, who was an All-American football player at Michigan in the late 30s, a lot of you will remember. And his plane was unable to land, and they got back out over the jungle, and they presumably thought everyone had been killed, and he ended up walking out of the jungle about a month later, which was kind of remarkable. And of course, when hundreds of people did this, but here was one that made the headlines. As personnel on planes became available, the operating bases were expanded onto the islands, and the coverage became more sophisticated. I was a supply and dispersing officer of VP 83, which at that time consisted of 12 PBY-5As, which I had watched being produced up in the Naval Aircraft Factory, provided the coastline coverage for convoys bound for North Africa and shipping between and among Brazilian ports. I guess I could use this map. Planes were centered in Natal, right there on the hump. And when the convoys would come down here and go across to Natal, or to Dakar, we would get a call for 3 planes to provide coverage, starting up here, maybe in Belém. And at that time, we didn't have any facilities there, so the planes would go, the crews would stay in a hotel there, and work maybe 2 or 3 days covering down to here. Then they would move one come down here to Fortaleza and provide the same sort of thing, then they get back home to Natal. And of course, the same down here. This coastwise coverage, and this is what triggered Brazil to come into the war at this point. There were sinkings right close to their shores, and they got upset about that. The responsibilities that I had were supplies, food, payroll, and paying bills. Shortly after arriving, I had to go from the airfield about 15 miles from Natal to obtain $50,000 in cruzeros, which was about 1 million cruzeros, to meet the payroll. Compare the following with what you would have to do to protect that act today. I had a standard money bag at 45 and rode in a truck to the bank. It was necessary to conceal the 45 in the bag because we were not allowed to show arms in any of the cities of Brazil during the whole stay we had there. I obtained the funds by signing and cashing a U.S. Treasury check and came back out the street to wait for the truck to pick me up. And it wasn't there. I just stood there and waited for a while. And it came. Crime in Brazil at that time was very controlled. Not so today. The last time I was there, which was in the middle 60s, you could not go out of your hotel. I was in Rio and Sao Paulo at that time, and they would advise you not to go out of your hotel because of one of the people that would be hanging on you begging. Secondly, there were prostitutes all over the area of the major hotels. And thirdly, you could get killed while picking up your watch. So Brazil did change. President Roosevelt visited the base in January of 1943 on his return from meeting Churchill at Casablanca. It was late in the day and we were playing volleyball when an open sedan came by with FDR in the back seat waving to us. It was a complete surprise. Think of this today, they'd probably have publicity out like that for 2 weeks before that. Later, planes reported having seen the battleship Iowa off the coast. It was interesting during those days to see the daily influx of B-17s assemble in the parking areas for the night. Crews slept in tents and departed the next morning. First B-17 I ever saw was at the Cleveland Air Races in 1939, the same day Germany attacked Poland. I thought it was a huge aircraft. In my mind it was. Later I saw B-29s on their way to the Far East coming through Natal, and then I knew what huge was. But now we're so accustomed to C-5s and 747s, we don't even think about it. But back in those days when you thought a DC-3 was a pretty big plane, why it was different. With the expansion of submarine coverage, the control of the area was moved from San Juan and organized into Fleet Air Wing 16 with many bases. Dawn, you have that 3 on there. I was transferred from Natal to Recife, where the major supply facility was established. This became the supplier for the other bases. Cargo ships came into Recife, were unloaded, and aviation materials were stored and distributed. Brazil has a long coastline and no internal communications in those go up to provide interim coverage. You have a squadron here, 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 here. But the principal ones were Victoria, Bahia, Lazio, Natal, Recife. Recife had a better port than any of these. Not as good as Bahia, but it was closer. And it was right as far close to Africa as you could get. So supply ships would come in there, unload. Supplies, aircraft supplies would be moved out to the airfield and stored there, then distributed by air or by ship out of there as needed in the various bases. The wing eventually had 7 squadrons, including PBY-5As, PB-4Ys, which was the Navy adaptation of the B-24, PBM Martin Mariner seaplanes, PV-1 Venturas, and some general service aircraft. This made a multiplicity of parts, and supply frequently had to be by radio to Norfolk to ship certain parts that were in close and tough supply. One of my responsibilities was a galley for flight rations located near the flight line, ready to supply hot food at all times for crews that would be out for 8 or 9 hours on submarine patrol. I flew with these crews in order to check out the food service every so often. Once I went aboard a Brazilian submarine, which was training with our planes. I think this was a World War I German submarine that had been turned over as reparations after World War I. This was a horrible experience. Submarines are bad enough, but this was not easy. I visited the submarine that is down in the Philadelphia Navy Yard and the one out in Pearl Harbor, also at the Arizona, and they were a lot better. And then I look at these atomic subs that are able to go for a year without servicing. It has come a long way. While delivering a small plane, which was a Grumman Widgeon, to the Brazilian government, the pilot and I flew out of Recife to Rio, and I took a picture of the statue of Christ overlooking the harbor at Rio. And Don, would you put that on number 4? Oh, you've got it on. Thank you. It almost seemed to me as I passed that I could reach out and touch it. It was a very eerie feeling. But this statue is 125 feet tall. It's called the Corcovado. And it's 2,300 feet above the harbor at Rio. It's the most fantastic view from up there, and if you are ever in Rio, that is a wonderful place to go. Think about things for a while. It was built by the French. It was the artist was in Paris. It was built in 1926 to 1931. By the time they got it to Paris and got it erected there, it was financed by the churches of Brazil. The convoys received better and better coverage under Fleet Air Wing 16. Fewer ships were sunk and the U-boats became less aggressive. Don, you want to put that 5 on there, please? You can see this is only nothing reflected from up here, but this was the situation between 22 May 43 and December 43. The effect of having this coverage blockade runners have been regularly coming around Cape Horn from the Far East, principally Malaysia and Japan, bringing rubber, oil, other critical supplies up to France and Germany. They were getting away with it pretty much. As Dawn had mentioned to you, they began to put together coverage of ships from the Fourth Fleet, which was based in Recife. And they were cruisers and destroyers. And these small carriers, that Globe being one of them, which will be a presentation later in the year. And they concentrated on these runs that would go up through here and pretty well cut it off. Dawn, you want to put the logo on there, number 6, please? That is it. Not a huge ship, but they were very effective and cooperated with Fleet Air Wing 16 in the planes that were coming off the coast of Brazil and off of Ascension and Fernando de Noronha. By, I guess, the first of 40, or maybe the middle of 44, where you did not have any more successful runs of ships going from the Far East getting through to France and Germany. One in particular was sunk off of Recife, and the crews that were rescued, from that ship were brought into our airfield at Recife, and we had, I don't know, maybe 50 survivors that were there for a couple of weeks till they could arrange transportation to the States. And I understood that they ended up somewhere around the Great Lake area and became quite effective workers in the various places where they could use this type of labor. And they were probably glad to be out of it. It was amazing to me how young these crewmen were. And the same with submarines. We would have a few survivors from submarines that were sunk off there, and they would, you'd look at them and you'd think they ought to be in high school.
You were by this time an old man of 26 or 27. Huh?
Yeah, right. I'm lucky to be that. 2 islands formed a part of Brazil coverage, Fernando de Noronha and Ascension. And
Put them out on this map. There's Ascension right there. Fernando is right there. Fernando de Noronha. But they had, Fernando had 2 or 3 planes assigned to it
regularly, but no squadron stayed there. That would be fed by from Natal or Recife. I guess duty of 2 or 3 weeks was enough up there. I flew over there once sharing the wicker seats of a Ford Trimotor, vintage 1929. I shared the wicker seats with frozen sides of beef, and if that isn't an eerie feeling.
Yeah.
Number 7, please, Dawn. types of facilities that we had in all of the bases, but this particular one is in Recife, but they were duplicated in 11 bases that we had. Here, well, there is the nose hanger. And the maintenance on the planes was done by drawing the plane in there with the nose covered and performing the work on the engines there. Can you all see down here that these are the low-level type buildings? I often wonder whether these are still in existence down there, because part of the arrangement with Brazil was that everything was left behind that was turned over to them.
Is this what originally started out as a seaplane base?
No.
These are built by the United States?
This was built
There's
by...
nothing there when you started?
Right. This was built by the ADP, the Aviation Development Project. And part of this was done before we ever got into the war. They were on a limited basis. They were still building at Natal when these planes were coming through. It was kind of funny. I had to adding to the runways and so on when 100 B-17s would be coming in there the same day. I have other pictures here of facilities. I'll pass it around. You can have a little bit of a look at something there. The climate in Natal and Recife was favorable. Hot, but lots of breeze. Belém was tropical. I don't mean that in like a summer resort. It was just plain humid. And actually, there was a smell to Belém that came out of the wet wood. Am I right? Bahia and Rio were more like the United States. Rio is a beautiful town, and Bahia had they both had marvelous port facilities. Brazilians were generally helpful. Many became employees of the Navy on a contract basis. Of course, Brazil benefited economically, and all the installations were turned over to them, and lots of aircraft were turned over to them, and of course, they received a lot of training. A lot of their pilots came up to the United States and spent months in Florida at training bases. Interestingly enough, the Navy was always pro-United States, and they allowed the Fourth Fleet to be berthed in Recife starting in April of 1941, well before we got into the war. And, there was a strong relationship built there between the two navies. The Brazilian Army, however, was German trained and was not receptive at that point. But it took these sinkings by submarines to trigger Brazil into the war in August of 1942. The language in Brazil is Portuguese. It was discovered by Portugal in 1500 when Portugal was a major sea power. Spain settled the rest of South America. Eventually, the papal line of demarcation split the continent between the two, and that has held. Brazil occupies half of the landmass of the continent. The country has great natural resources: iron ore, gold, precious stones. 90% of the precious stones in the world come from Brazil, and offshore oil. It had and has trouble developing them. It is often said that Brazil has a great future and always will. The Catholic Church is the dominant religion. There are beautiful sights to be seen, natural and architecturally. Unfortunately, back then there was no middle class, and I don't think there's a middle class existence today. There is terrible poverty in lots of the places. Late in August 1944, I was transferred back to the States. Helen and I had arranged to meet wherever I came into the United States and be married, and it turned out to be Miami, and we were married by a Navy chaplain. I told you this was going to be personal. I again had proceed and report orders with no leave to Carrier Aircraft Service Unit 21 at Naval Air Station Norfolk, where I was to be the supply officer. We had 4 large hangars at East Field and 4 outlying fields where planes were based and worked against the carriers. Actually, there was a carrier, the Charger, based out of Norfolk, which was used for training. And then, of course, the air groups, as they progressed in their training, would eventually meet up with their carrier that they were to go to the Pacific in. Actually, Norfolk was the last place in the world I wanted to go to because I heard all the time I was in Brazil from all the regulars that how awful Norfolk was for duty, but it didn't turn out that way for me. I enjoyed duty there, and it was a great place to be, and it was close to Commander Air Lant, and that puts you in a position where you could get supplies that normally you'd be begging for, and it was a good thing for me, for Cashew 21. It is interesting to note that the Battle of the Atlantic continued to the end of the war with Germany. One U-boat sunk a ship 28 hours before Germany surrendered and was in turn sunk. Of the remaining U-boats at sea, 181 surrendered, 217 were destroyed by their crews, and 2 fled to the Argentine. Patrol plane duty consisted of long hours looking out over vast expanses of water. Less than 5% of the time resulted in contacts. And this can be hard on crews. Boredom can set in. You can really get kind of upset with things. I'm going to make a few comments about things in Brazil because you're down there for almost 2 years. Why you see a lot of things that, as I thought back over the time I spent there, these things pop up into your mind. But soccer is a big sport there. It wasn't so big here in the United States during World War II or in the 30s, but Brazil has won the World Cup a number of times. They attract huge crowds, much bigger than the biggest football crowd that we ever had. You see on the beaches, soccer is played all the time. People will gather together like we might on the beaches, the Jersey Shore, have volleyball. Well, they'll have soccer. And you see a group of young people around someplace along a sidewalk, and they'll throw a bundle of paper. I don't know how one of them take some papers and crush them into a bunch, and they'll play soccer with them in a confined area like this. And their skills at that are amazing. It's no wonder they win the World Cup. The mouth of the Amazon, this huge river ends up, you can see the ground sediment clear 100 miles out into the Atlantic Ocean there. That was always something that amazed me. Also, you always had to avoid French Guiana because they were still under Vichy France and never established a government there like the Free French in
lot past the 12-mile line, or past French Guiana. Not so with Suriname, which is what it's called now, but it was Dutch Guiana then. And of course, British Guiana, there was a base there, and we could use that base right out of Trinidad.
Interestingly enough, the schedule out of New York to Rio now is 10 hours, nonstop, of course. Then it took 5 days to get to Recife. Brasilia is the capital now since 1960, and it was a big event right there. Rio had been the capital. Of course, it was a choice place for legislators to be. They loved it. What the political aspect was to move more of Brazil inland instead of just this fringe. And they built a wonderful capital within 3 years' time, and they moved the government up there. But interestingly enough, comes Friday, they all come back to Rio. It's a deserted town over the weekend. I think they'll probably get over that eventually. I suppose it was like Washington was in 1795 or thereabouts, when Philadelphia had been the capital. New York was the capital, then Philadelphia was the capital. Then they moved it to Washington. I suppose the legislators came back to Philadelphia on the weekends or whatever. Although that trip wouldn't be as easy. Another interesting thing was the celebration of Carnival in Brazil. That happened a week before Ash Wednesday, and I think we really don't have anything except one day before Ash Wednesday. Maybe in New Orleans they have it for a little longer than that, but this would last for a week, and I was there for 2 carnivals. It was really something. They go wild. I suppose that it becomes quite a tourist event these days. Well, I was released in active duty in January of 1946 as a lieutenant, and I stayed in the reserve until 1954. Thank you for listening to me. As I said, this was my personal account. Nothing monumental about it, and I always felt that I was very, very fortunate. Thank you. Any questions? Oh.
Did you have anything to do with that German battleship, the British State?
No, that was in 1939. Right here, between Montevideo and Buenos Aires, is a flat right in here, and it was they were trying to escape from the British ships that were assigned to chase them down there, and they bottled them up in the harbor there, and rather than be sunk, they took the ship Grouse Bay out there and sunk it themselves. The crews stayed in the Argentine. Yes?
I noticed on your maps in the early part of the war how many ships were sunk off the Jersey coast in
Yeah.
that area. Then the next map you put up where they started to go down to the Brazilian area, it fell away up there where there wasn't much. What caused that falling away?
Well, I think what I showed on that slide was only the South Atlantic. I mean, it was that last one. the southern,
So they
it
were
just
still up
didn't,
there.
didn't plot it there, didn't plot it, that was all.
I see.
That was the, you have it, Don?
Yeah, you're talking about the last one?
The last one, yes.
It's identified as merchant ship sunk by U-boat in the Atlantic, activities in southern waters.
In southern waters. But
So, but I see a couple
So you don't have
more
any
up
up
there.
there. Well, wait, you do have some up there.
Yeah. So I think it's, the inference was that the submarines had been, the wolf packs had moved south.
Yeah.
I read some of this in a book which I got as a result of some of the earlier talks here. I got it down at Barnes and Noble, The Two Ocean War, a short history of the United States Navy in the Second World War by Samuel Eliot Morrison. And a couple of the slides came out of here, and the third one came out of his 15-volume history of the Navy as a naval historian. He was a captain, I think, during that period.
yeah, he was the official historian.
But I have, there are other pictures in there that show the number of subs that were sunk, or the number of ships that were sunk as a plot. One of the naval officers plotted it versus time, and it sort of went up and down, and the number of submarines that were sunk. And the ratio, originally there were quite a large number, maybe 5 ship sinkings per submarine sinking. Initially, we weren't sinking submarines because we weren't prepared for it. That was probably a major weakness in our preparation. Then later on, they did find that the Admiral Donitz, is that it? Donitz, German, a German leader of the sub, who eventually became the leader of Germany after Hitler departed. And he was the one who accepted the surrender terms. But they were, the totals were something like 2,500, I think, merchant ships sunk and about 700 submarines sunk. So that averages out to about 3 ship sinkings per submarine.
You know, when I was a teenager, walking the boardwalk with my parents in Atlantic City, back in 42, and I didn't see it, but I know people down there used to see the ships blowing up over the horizon while they were walking the pool.
Oh, yeah.
Part of the reason it was happening was because all of the lights from the boardwalk silhouetted the ships, and the submarines just sank and waited out there, surfaced, and waiting and launched their torpedoes. It's a little bit like the games, you know, where the planes go across the screen and you shoot at them.
Yes.
Did the USO remember you guys?
No, I don't think we had any USO down there.
We had, well, I was down there in 44 to 46. USO was an all Recife. They had a beach club down in Recife.
Really? I went home too soon.
So what'd you do for recreation? That's interesting, about a half hour.
The volleyball was one thing. There was no baseball, which surprises me as I think back over it. Handball was another thing. Yes, movies were a daily factor. They were very, very important for everybody's morale there. And if the plane that was to bring the movie for that night didn't come, why, it was desperation in it. Because boredom, you know, you were there 7 days a week, and you worked all the time because there wasn't anything else to do. It wasn't difficult to get people to do their jobs continually. We were far enough away from the cities, 15 to 20 miles, that you didn't go in regularly. It just didn't occur to you. But cards were important. I guess guess that's about the extent of the recreation. As I say, boredom was probably the biggest enemy of morale there. Well, I went in as an ensign, I'd be a second lieutenant, and I came out as a lieutenant, which was captain. And, yeah, I was. Yes.
Did you ever hear the story about the submarine was supposed to have moved the beam, the radio beam from on Ascension Island, so that our planes went out and they couldn't make Ascension Island, they didn't?
No, I never did.
I heard that story, I don't know, I just thought I'd ask you.
But lots of planes did miss
Miss
Ascension,
Ascension,
and if
yeah,
you missed
right.
Ascension, why,
You're
you didn't get to Africa because you were going into Ascension because you didn't have fuel supply to go there. But, and of course, you can notice,
If you don't hit the hump, you've got a lot further to go. Of course, B-29s were coming to India, and they can make this from the factory without.
Then I heard that the German submarines had shot down a few of our planes, the BB-1.
oh, yes, oh, they
They
did.
had deck guns that were, anti-aircraft guns that were, because.
Oh, yeah, they tried to save their torpedoes, and they would use the deck guns.
But I mean, they could also shoot down our planes.
Oh, yeah. They've got 50 millimeter machine guns on deck. And,
Because there were a number of people who there was a grave in the town, I mean, the graveyard in West America. But
Yeah.
they said those fellows were shot, were wounded on the planes and killed.
yeah, and,
Those BB-1s were pretty ponderous anyhow, weren't they? They were very fast.
120
no,
miles.
95 to 125 miles an hour. We used to look up and say they're flying the kites today.
The British used to call them flying the kites, they were flying a kite.
Right.
But we had British communications on Ascension Island, Canadian.
I enjoyed your presentation very much, thank you. I'd like to know how you overcome the nervousness of being up there in front of a group like this, because I'm coming up next month. I have a story to tell, and I want to tell it, but that's the only thing that worries me, is being up there.
Well, then you're doing well from a seated position. Sit down.
I noticed that. Should we move the lectern over there then?
I don't think you'll have any trouble.
You might insert in your notes that it was one German submarine captured in 505, that was June the 4th. D-Day, 1964. It's up in Chicago right now.
Oh, really? Yes.
I knew a fellow on the quarry who was instrumental, was captain of the 505.
Oh, on the 505?
He was on board ship too.
Who was that?
Charlie Stanton.
Repeat, I didn't hear the story.
The 505 was captured. He was rammed by the quarry, old square. And the seagulls dug the mountain to pull it in. The quarry had to be sunk itself. You must have the story I got.
Yeah.
We were throwing it, I was on a Navy tank, we were throwing the aerial
A
flight.
little louder so people can hear you behind too, unless you want to stand up here. Oh, because they'd like to hear it. They're listening, so tell it so we can all hear it, is what I'm saying. Don, what about the ladies in their group? Are they WW2 buffs? More buffs? Or were you in the service? Were you no? Neither were we.
Yeah, we weren't either.
But I wondered after last meeting, the women, somebody else had suggested, just today, I think it was, that there were women that were principally, there were women that were, a lot of them in the Red Cross that had a lot of pretty gory conditions that they got involved in. And of course, the Army and Navy nurses were out there too. I'm looking for a couple of nurses from Bataan. None of you were there.
I wanted to tell your wife about this.
CBE 60, which was the Quad Canal. And the Quad Canal had a couple of PBFs on it, and they wanted to bring them in and then launch another patrol. So the way I understand it, they didn't want to stop fueling the carriers, so they turned both the ships at one time while it kept on fueling. And then they launched the other two planes. And the other two planes, I understand, we didn't actually see the action, but the planes marked the location of the submarine with the machine guns, and then they then charged it up. Well, they did. That's the way I understand it. I don't remember the glory being involved in it, unless that happened before, because a couple of days prior to that, one of the aircraft carriers off the island, which was the same type, responded to it. Then, anyhow, they sent a seagull tug out, and they brought that back, back to Bermuda, and they lost it at night. And they finally did find it again, and then they took it on up to the St. Lawrence Seaway, Chicago.
What was the name of the old four-stacker you were talking about? I think I saw the story in here in the book.
Warrie, D-O-R-I-E.
B-O-R-I-E. Anybody interested in seeing what the book
My
says?
father sent me an article from the Saturday Evening Post. I'm going to get that out again and read it. I don't remember what the word mentions.
Page 370 to 473. At 200 on November 1, Borey blew a different submarine, U-405, to the surface by a shower of depth charges. Is this a different story? Okay. Hutchins opened fire with a main 4-inch battery and machine guns at 1,400 yards. 1,700 yards is a mile, so it gives you a feel of distance. Closed range tried to ram and actually rode his destroyer right up over the U-boat's forecastle. The two ships remained locked in deadly embrace, one under the other, for 10 minutes. Two of Borey's 4-inch and 3 machine guns kept up continuous fire on the sub's conning tower, and that part of her deck still above water. Negro mess attendants who manned a 20-millimeter battery fired right through the metal weather screen. Blue jackets, not otherwise occupied, firing Tommy guns, pistols, shotguns, rifles, or whatever they could lay their hands on at the Germans. A sheath knife hurled by a fireman buried itself in the belly of a submariner running to man a gun. In a heavy sea, the two vessels pounded and rolled against each other, adding the noise of grinding steel to the roar of gunfire, the clatter of machine guns, the human shouts and screams. At this time, Borey's Black Gang, I guess that's the
Engineering group.
was making a gallant fight to keep up steam. The destroyer's plates, light enough at her berth in 1920, had by now been chipped and rusted almost paper thin, and the whole port side became crushed and hold as it ground against the U-boat's hard pressure hull. All hands working in water chest high stuck to their stations, and Engineer Officer M.R. Brown, USNR, managed to keep up full power even with salt water was lapping the boiler. And continue. I got started looking at specific things in here, particularly I was interested in the boat, which we're going to be talking about. And my problem was I couldn't stop when I got to the end of the part I was interested in, because I was interested in the next paragraph. And so it's quite good.
Was there another question back there? Yes.
A small one. Did you have any blimps down there in Brazil?
Eventually, they got some blimps down there, but they weren't very effective. Yes.
The convoys that went over to Africa, they went over to Dakar.
Yes.
So now, was that controlled by the Vichy French or the Free French? Wasn't there an issue with that also?
Oh, yes, there was an issue there, but eventually,
So did some of those convoys have to be rerouted or
no, because French who were in all these areas here and in here to cooperate. Eventually, they sunk the French fleet, and the landings were made here, where they were made with relatively great success in working with the French that were there. But it wasn't all that easy right at first. But when the planes were coming over here, why we had already been established here, and Dakar and Casablanca were, trying to find one right now. Here's Dakar, and oh no.
To the left.
Casablanca's on the Atlantic, right here, in Morocco, and on the Atlantic. But by the time our convoys or our B-17s were destined for here, we had moved into here. The Army was in control there, and eventually, of course, ended up in Italy, here in Sicily.
Am I correct that Admiral Leahy had a lot to do with naval operations? And if so, do you have any comment to make on it?
Well, he was very close to President Roosevelt. Of course, Admiral King was Commander-in-Chief. He was CNO, he was combined CNO and what do they call it? Sink land. No, not land. He was the top. They combined those jobs into one. But Leahy was aide to President Roosevelt and attended all of these conferences like Casablanca. But Ernest King was the active admiral during all that period of time. And then, of course, after the war, they broke those two jobs up again into CNO and Commander-in-Chief Naval Operations.
What's your opinion, having been in the Navy those years, of what happened in Pearl Harbor? Do you think Admiral Kimmel was responsible for what happened over there, or?
Well, I think anyone who was there was going to be responsible, would have to be responsible for the day-to-day activities, and the lack of alertness, even when crisis dispatches had reached him in the weeks before. Now, the one that Friday or that Saturday should have reached and didn't, for whatever reason. It was stalled around in communications in Washington, but I think that you have to be responsible.
Do you think it's fair what they did to him during the war and after the war, and there's still some efforts by his grandchildren to have his name vindicated? So there's been a lot of talk that Roosevelt wanted the United States to get into the war, and the only way to get into the war was to get into something real big, and no carriers were sent to Pearl Harbor, just all the carriers were.
Yeah, but when you think of losing, 9 battleships, which was, in that time, we weren't thinking that carriers were.
But battleships then they weren't as useful as carriers. So
that hadn't been proved yet.
They were just,
that hadn't been proven though.
in those days, the battleships, actually, the carriers were the ones that played a big role in this.
Well, that's the way it worked out, but when you think of losing 9 battleships, the German, or the Germans
May I have your attention, please?
had very
The
important
library is closing in 30
battleships.
minutes. The copy has been
And
returned out in 15
the
minutes.
Japanese had
Please make your
battleships
copies
that
now.
were
Thank you.
bigger than anything we had. They had 18-inch guns on them compared to 16-inch on all of our major battleships. Some of ours had only 14-inch guns. Yes?
How can you account for the fact that the entire fleet was concentrated in one area? I mean, that seems to be a stupid strategy.
We were not at war.
Well,
sides of it that you ought to be better prepared, and yet when nothing has happened, it's like the boredom of the guys flying the planes. There might be an awful lot of submarines down there, and you've been flying for however many hours out there and seeing nothing, and so you're sleeping a little
But
bit
the
when you don't
United
be much.
States knew that Germany was arming itself since 1930.
Yeah.
Very heavily.
Yeah.
They knew everything that was going
Yeah.
on in Europe. They took over different parts of Europe, in 1938, 39. The war had been going on for over 2 years, from September
Yeah.
1939. This is December 41, and here we are asleep.
Yep.
It's
Well,
kind of,
don't you remember
with all the geniuses we had in
Hindsight is pretty good.
No, this is not hindsight.
I mean, today our hindsight is hindsight.
I mean, the war had been going on for 2 years,
Yeah.
and everybody knew what Hitler was all about.
Well, the public was not ready to get
Well,
involved.
that's why,
And-
that's where the thing I was telling you before about Pearl Harbor, right? These guys over there just,
The
they
new-
knew about Japan, they knew Japan's intentions.
I read
This
somewhere,
is no secret.
I'm not sure if I read it in here or in something else, that there was nothing that could have been done to get us into the war more than what the Japanese did. They didn't realize it, but they were turning the U.S. on. And it couldn't have happened any more
We needed
effectively.
something like Pearl Harbor
Yeah.
to get us in the way we went in, you know. And of course, we said, well, you know, they probably, the big wigs in Washington said, well, we're gonna have to sacrifice. You know, in Congress, you couldn't get, you know, there were a lot of people, in this country who wanted to get into the war. That was a European war.
Yeah.
Germany was taking over the rest of the
Yeah.
world. They were strong. Japan was
Yeah.
on the other side, and here we are sitting, you know, and we thought we were gonna be
We don't want to get in it.
yeah.
Well, the Neutrality Act was what was the law of the land at that point. And,
England was being bombed day and night for 2 years
Yeah.
before.
And we were supplying things.
We had a
to-
hard time trying to get 50 old destroyers, you know, we had to do all this.
Yeah, I was in Pittsburgh the weekend of Pearl Harbor, and Colonel Lindbergh was talking at Heinz Hall in East Liberty, Pittsburgh, that night before, on Saturday night. And of course, he was against any involvement and supported the Germans, really.
He was definitely pro-Nazi.
Pro-Nazi.
Yeah.
And
And Henry Ford.
that was an unusual thing.
But there were a lot of people in Congress, a lot of senators, a lot of congressmen, they were just flatly opposed to the United States considering even going into the war. Here, Germany was taking over all of Europe. England was ready.
Yeah.
Japan, you know, was on the other side.
Before we leave, let me get something else in here on it. I've got a piece of mechanics here I've got to do. I'm supposed to tell how many adults, how many high school age 14 to 18, how many elementary school 6 to 13, and I'm not going to ask for preschool because I don't think they're here. Do we have 6 to 13-year-olds here? Attaboy, bring some of your buddies. How about 14 to 18? One, we need more. And the rest of them, I've counted, there's 42, so I'm presuming everybody else is adult. Just as a question, how many of you are here for the first time? Well, quite a few.
Have there been previous lectures?
We've had, this is the third one, we had 45 at the first one and 50 at the second one. So our promotional activity isn't working, or else the stories are no good, and the people aren't coming back.
Nobody comes next time.
The first one was the Battle of Lady Gulf, which Joe Nemick was in and told us about, and the next one was the Okinawa and the Kamikaze. We have videotaped these, and I'd like to get some help on editing the tapes to add titles and figures and stuff, so that we'll have permanent records in the library about it.
When is the next one?
Yeah, so look at your piece of paper I handed out. It's the third Tuesday